The earth gave way under the spade with a sigh of damp surrender. Elias drove the steel blade down again, his weight sinking into the step, feeling the familiar jarring shock travel up his arms and settle in his shoulders. It was a rhythm he had known since late spring, a percussion of metal on soil, of breath and muscle against the patient resistance of the land. Beside him, Boro, a great, quiet dog whose coat held the color of dusk, watched with intelligent yellow eyes. He did not pant or fidget, but simply observed, his head cocked as if he were memorizing the geometry of the hole growing steadily deeper in the yard behind the small cabin. The hole was now 9 feet deep, 20 feet long, and 10 feet wide, its sides shored up with rough-hewn timbers to keep the loamy soil from collapsing inward. Mr. Gable stopped his wagon on the track that ran past Elias's property, the tired creak of the wheels a familiar sound in the late August air. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, his face a roadmap of winters endured. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed with a dark splash in the dust. "Still at it, boy?" Elias paused, resting his hands on the worn handle of the spade. He nodded once, not wasting the breath a word would require. "Going on 4 months of digging," Gable observed, his voice raspy with disapproval. "A man could have cleared another 5 acres in that time, planted a winter crop. You're digging a grave, not a foundation." "It's for winter," Elias said. The words were quiet, nearly swallowed by the vastness of the valley. Gable squinted, his gaze dropping into the precisely cut rectangle in the earth. "For winter? What in God's name for? A root cellar that deep will flood come the spring thaw. Everything will rot. I've lived in this valley 60 years. I know the soil. I know the water." "It won't flood," Elias stated. He turned back to his work, driving the spade into the earth again. The conversation, for him, was over. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen," Gable muttered, shaking his head. He flicked the reins, and the wagon groaned back into motion. "Wait until winter, you'll see." Boro whined softly, a low note of concern in his throat. Elias reached down and ran a hand over the dog's broad head, his fingers scratching behind the ears. The coarse fur was warm from the sun. He didn't look after the departing wagon. The words of his neighbors had long ago ceased to trouble him. They were noise, like the wind in the pines or the chatter of jays in the oak grove, predictable and meaningless. His purpose was not in their understanding, but in the pages of his father's journal. That night, by the flickering light of a single tallow lamp, he sat at the small pine table his father had built and opened the worn leather-bound book. The pages were filled with a small, precise hand, the ink faded to a soft brown. Diagrams of stone and earth, arrows indicating the flow of air and heat. Calculations of mass and thermal retention filled the margins. His father had not been a simple farmer. He had been a student of the old ways, of Roman hippocausts and Russian stoves. A man who saw the earth not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner to be understood. "The ground itself is a battery," he had written. "It holds the memory of heat. The stone is the vessel. You don't fight the cold, you store the warmth. You build a heart of stone underground, and you feed it slowly, patiently, all through the autumn. Let the earth itself become your hearth." Elias traced a diagram of a long, stone-lined flue, a channel that would run from the back of his cabin's main fireplace, deep underground, and into the heart of the stone structure he was building. It looked like a root, a strange man-made artery connecting the world above with the world below. the neighbors saw a hole. His father's journal showed him a lung, a reservoir, a silent engine of survival. He had read these pages 100 times until the theories felt as real and solid as the calluses on his hands. He was an orphan, the last of his line, and this book was his only inheritance. This and the quiet, stubborn patience his father had instilled in him. He would not fail the memory of the man who had filled these pages. The next morning, he began hauling the stones. He had spent the previous summer collecting them, pulling them from the fast-running creek that bordered his land. They were smooth and dense, worn by 1,000 years of water, in sizes ranging from a loaf of bread to a small sheep. Using a stone boat, a heavy wooden sledge pulled by his old mule, he dragged them one by one to the edge of the pit. The work was brutal, a slow, grinding torment on his back and legs. Each stone was a dead weight, an argument against motion. He would wrap it in chains, lever it onto the sledge with a thick oak pole, and urge the mule forward, the runners groaning over the dry grass. Boro walked alongside, a silent shadow of encouragement. Days turned into weeks. The pile of stones grew into a small gray mountain. The valley began to turn, the vibrant green of summer softening into the gold and rust of early autumn. Lena, the blacksmith's daughter, sometimes walked the track on her way back from gathering herbs in the high meadows. She never mocked. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, held a genuine curiosity. One afternoon, she stopped, holding out a tin pail. "I drew too much from the well," she said, a faint blush on her cheeks. "It's cold." Elias stopped his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He took the pail and drank deeply, the water a shock of life in his throat. He drank until the pail was half empty. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She watched him for a moment, her gaze moving from the pit to the mountain of stones and back to his face. "Mr. Gable says you're wasting your time." Elias handed the pail back to her. "Mr. Gable can say what he likes." "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. "Truly." He considered the question. No one had asked it that way before. They had only told him what they thought it was. He looked at the deep, shadowed rectangle, at the patient stones waiting to be placed. "It's a heat room," he said. It was the first time he had given it a name aloud. "A heat room," she repeated, tasting the words. She nodded slowly, as if the name itself was a sufficient explanation. "You have a plan." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a quiet offering of trust. Elias met her eyes and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun or his labor. "I have a plan," he confirmed. She smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "Be careful with those stones," she said, and continued on her way. Elias watched her go, then turned back to his work. He felt lighter, the next stone he lifted seeming to weigh a little less. He began laying the foundation of the room first, a thick, 3-foot-wide base of the largest stones, fitted together with the precision of a jeweler. He had no mortar yet. This was the dry stacking his father's journal described, a base designed to shift with the frost and not break. Upon this, he began to build the walls, a double course of stone, leaving a 2-foot gap between the inner and outer layers. This gap, the journal explained, was crucial. It would be filled with dry sand and gravel, creating an insulating barrier that would prevent the stored heat from leaching away into the surrounding earth. He mixed his own mortar from clay, sand, and horsehair, a sticky, stubborn mixture that he troweled into place with aching wrists. The inner walls rose course by course, the stones carefully chosen to lock together, creating a surface that was solid and unyielding. The sheer physical output was immense. He would work from the first hint of dawn until the light failed, his muscles screaming in protest. He ate standing up, hunks of bread and salted pork, his mind always on the next stone, the next layer. His hands, already calloused, began to split and bleed. At night, he would wash them in a basin of hot water and salt, watching the pink clouds swirl before rubbing them with tallow. Lena brought him a jar of comfrey salve one evening. She said nothing, just placed it on the porch rail and left. It smelled of earth and green things, and it soothed the fire in his skin. As the walls climbed past the height of a man, he began constructing the core. This was the heart of the design, the element that drew the most scornful laughter from those who stopped to watch. In the center of the room, he built a massive, freestanding pillar of stone, but it was hollow, honeycombed with channels and vents made from carefully placed slate tiles. It was an intricate, three-dimensional puzzle. This was the heat sink. The long, insulated flue he had dug from his cabin's fireplace would feed into the bottom of this central column. The hot air and smoke from the fire would be drawn down the flue, circulate through the labyrinthine passages inside the stone core, and slowly release their heat into the massive thermal battery of the stones. The cooled smoke would then exit through a second, smaller flue that vented out on the far side of the yard, 100 feet away. Mr. Sterling, the wealthiest man in the valley, who owned the mill and held the mortgage on half the farms, reined in his fine black horse to watch one afternoon. He was a large man, soft in a way that spoke of a life free from physical labor. "Gable told me you were building a folly, but I see he understated it," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're building a tomb for yourself, boy. That thing will sweat and crumble before the first deep frost. And what's this nonsense in the middle, an altar to some pagan god of rocks?" His companions, 2 other landowners, laughed. Elias placed a stone, tapping it level with the handle of his trowel. He did not look up. "Mark my words," Sterling continued, enjoying his audience. "When the blizzard comes and your fire won't draw because of this contraption, you'll freeze to death in the dark. It's a tragedy. What happens to a boy with no proper guidance?" He spurred his horse and rode away, the laughter trailing behind him. Elias paused and looked at the central column. It was complex and strange. He could see why they laughed. It did not look like anything they knew. It looked like a mistake, but he could feel the rightness of it in his hands, the solid logic of his father's design. He picked up another stone. The work was his only answer. By mid-October, the walls were complete, rising 2 feet above ground level. He built a roof of thick, rough-sawn oak beams, leaving a single opening for a heavy, insulated trapdoor. He laid a double layer of planking over the beams, sealed the gaps with pitch, and then, in the final, back-breaking stage, he covered the entire structure with the earth he had first excavated. He shoveled for 4 solid days, burying his creation, until all that remained was a gentle, grassy mound in his yard, indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape except for the low stone lip of the entrance and the small, distant vent pipe. The aspens had dropped their leaves, carpeting the valley in a brittle layer of gold. The air had a new edge to it, a sharp, crystalline quality that promised cold. The signs the old-timers had noted were coming true. The squirrels were frantic, their caches overflowing. The coats on the deer were thicker than anyone could remember. A hard winter was coming. Elias could feel it in his bones, a deep, resonant hum of anticipation. He spent a week splitting and stacking firewood. Not a huge amount, far less than his neighbors. Mr. Gable's woodpile was a fortress, a testament to his belief in brute force warmth. Elias's was modest. His father's journal was clear. The goal is not a roaring fire, but a constant, steady ember. You are not heating the air in your house. You are heating the stone in the earth. The day came. He sealed the flue damper that led to his conventional chimney and opened the one to the underground channel. He laid a small fire in his cabin's hearth, just a few pieces of seasoned oak, and lit it. He did not expect immediate results. This was the beginning of a long, slow charge. He went about his day, mending a harness, sharpening his axe. Every few hours, he would add a single log to the fire, keeping it small and consistent. Boro lay by the hearth, not for the warmth, but out of habit, his eyes following Elias's every move. That night, Elias opened the heavy trap door and descended the stone steps into the heat room. The air was cool, but not the damp, biting chill of a cellar. It was a neutral coolness, dry and still. He placed his palm against the central stone column. It was cold to the touch. He felt a flicker of doubt, a cold knot in his stomach. The laughter of Sterling echoed in his mind. He pushed it away. His father's words returned. Patience. It takes days for the heart to warm. He continued the slow fire for a week. Each night he would check the stone. On the third night, the surface was no longer cold. On the fifth, it felt neutral. On the seventh night, when he descended the steps, the air in the room was noticeably different. It was not warm, but it was no longer cold. A subtle, ambient presence had replaced the chill. He pressed his hand to the central pillar. A faint, deep warmth radiated from it, a barely perceptible pulse of stored energy. It was working. He looked at the massive, silent stones surrounding him, and for the first time, he felt a profound sense of safety. He was not alone. He was sheltered by the wisdom of his father and the strength of the earth. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted by noon. The second came a week later and stayed, a thin white blanket that crisped under his boots. The real cold settled in. The neighbors' cabins all had thick plumes of smoke rising from their chimneys, a sign of the great fires they were burning to keep the encroaching chill at bay. From Elias's chimney, only a thin, lazy wisp of smoke curled into the gray sky. Gable stopped by one morning, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Your fire out, boy?" he asked, a note of genuine concern in his voice. "No," Elias said. "It's burning." Gable looked from the pathetic trickle of smoke to Elias, who wore only a wool shirt and jacket, not the heavy coat everyone else had donned. He shook his head in disbelief. "I don't understand it. It's 10 degrees out here. My cabin eats a cord of wood a week in this weather." "I have enough," Elias said simply. "A fluke," Gable decided, though he looked less certain than before. "An odd draft in your flue. Wait for the real cold. When it's 30 below and the wind is howling, that little ghost of a fire won't do a thing." The real cold arrived 2 weeks before Christmas. It came not as a storm, but as a silent, invisible invasion. The sky was a brilliant, pitiless blue, but the air itself felt solid, a weight of pure cold that stole the breath and burned the lungs. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there. The river froze solid. The trees groaned under the strain, their trunks splitting with loud cracks that sounded like rifle shots in the still air. This was the test. Inside Elias's cabin, it was comfortable. Not hot, but a steady, even temperature that required no more than a sweater. The floorboards near the hearth were pleasantly warm to the touch. The small fire in the hearth barely seemed to notice the brutal cold outside, its smoke drawn eagerly down into the earth. The heat room was now a reservoir of deep, radiant warmth. It had taken a month of slow charging, but the stone heart was beating, pushing a gentle, constant wave of heat up into the foundation of the cabin above. He used less than a quarter of the wood Gable burned, yet his home was warmer. The blizzard began on a Tuesday. The sky, which had been clear for a week, turned the color of slate, a low, oppressive ceiling that seemed to press down on the valley. Boro became restless, pacing the cabin and whining low in his throat, his gaze fixed on the door. The wind began to whisper, then moan, then shriek. Snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in a solid, horizontal torrent that erased the world. Elias was prepared. He had food, water, and a steady supply of wood stacked inside. He checked the fire, adding a single log. The draft down the flue was strong, a hungry, sucking sound. The system was stable. He sat at his table, listening to the storm rage, the cabin groaning under the assault of the wind. Boro lay at his feet, trembling, but seemed to draw comfort from his master's calm. The storm howled for 2 days without pause. The snow piled in monstrous drifts, burying fences and swallowing sheds. The world was reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin and the white fury outside. On the 3rd morning, the wind lessened slightly, but the snow fell even heavier, thick, wet flakes that clung to every surface. Through a momentary lull in the wind, Elias heard a sound, a desperate cracking boom, followed by a faint shout, quickly devoured by the storm. He went to the window, rubbing a clear patch on the frost-caked pane. He could see nothing but a swirling vortex of white. But he knew the sound. It was the sound of a roof beam giving way under a load it could no longer bear. An hour later, the pounding came at his door. It was frantic, a desperate drumming that barely rose above the gale. Elias unbarred the door, and a figure stumbled in, followed by a blast of snow and wind that felt like a physical blow. It was Mrs. Gable, her face a mask of frozen tears, her shawl caked in ice. "Elias!" she gasped, her words choked with panic. "Our roof! A section over the main room. It's gone. The snow is pouring in. The fire's out. I can't get it lit again. And John, he's so cold." Behind her, Mr. Gable staggered into the room, leaning heavily on his wife. He was covered in snow, his face a ghastly shade of blue-gray, his body racked with violent shivers. He looked at Elias, his eyes wide with fear and a dawning, terrible understanding. "Help us," he whispered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Elias did not hesitate. He took Gable's arm, his own strength surprising him, and guided the older man towards the hearth. "Sit," he commanded. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket and wrapped it around Gable's shaking shoulders. He turned to Mrs. Gable. "There's a better place, downstairs." He led them to the trap door, pulled it open, and gestured down the stone steps. A wave of still, dry warmth rose to meet them. It was not the scorching heat of a fire, but a deep, enveloping warmth, as gentle and pervasive as summer twilight. The Gables stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Go," Elias said gently. Mrs. Gable helped her husband down the steps. When he reached the stone floor of the room below, Mr. Gable let out a long, shuddering sigh, as if a tension he had been holding for 60 years had finally broken. The shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He sank onto a wooden bench Elias had built against one wall. "What is this place?" Mrs. Gable whispered, looking around at the massive, warm stone walls, the central pillar radiating a silent, invisible energy. The fury of the blizzard was completely gone, replaced by a profound and absolute silence. "My heat room," Elias answered. He went back up to the cabin to fetch more blankets and the pot of stew that was simmering on the trivet by the fire. They were not the last. As the day wore on, others came. The Millers, whose woodshed had been blown apart, their entire winter supply of fuel scattered by the wind. The young Cooper family, with their 2 small children, their cabin's chimney blocked by a mountain of drifted snow, filling the room with smoke. Each time, a desperate pounding at the door, a story of failure and fear. Each time, Elias led them down into the quiet, impossible warmth of the room under the earth. They huddled together, strangers and neighbors, their social distinctions erased by the shared, primal need for shelter. The last to arrive were the Sterlings. Mr. Sterling's fine house, built on an exposed ridge, had lost half its windows to the wind. His arrogance had been scoured away by the cold, leaving behind a small, frightened man. His wife was weeping silently. He did not meet Elias's eyes as he was led down the stairs. He simply found a space on the floor and collapsed, humbled by a force he could not buy or intimidate. 23 people found refuge in the heat room. Elias moved among them, a quiet, reassuring presence. He shared his food, tended to the frostbitten hands of a child, and spoke only when necessary. Lena and her father were there, their own small smithy buried to the eaves. She helped him, her movements calm and efficient, their unspoken understanding a silent anchor in the crowded room. During a lull in the storm, on the 4th day, Mr. Gable looked up at Elias from his bench. The color had returned to his face. The shivering was long gone. He had been watching Elias, watching the small, steady fire in the cabin above, feeling the impossible, life-giving warmth of the stones around him. "You knew," Gable said, his voice raspy with emotion. He wasn't talking about the storm. He was talking about everything, the digging, the stones, the ridicule. "All this time, you knew." Elias simply nodded. "Your father," Gable continued, his voice cracking. "He was no fool. We were the fools, all of us." He looked around the room, at the faces of his neighbors, all alive, all warm, all saved by the work he had mocked. He looked back at Elias, and his eyes were wet with tears of shame and gratitude. "This is our home," he said, echoing a phrase he'd heard the boy use once. But he gave it a new meaning. Not just the cabin, but the whole community. This was their home, and it had almost been their grave. When the storm finally broke, after 5 days, the world that emerged was alien and hostile. The valley was buried under 15 feet of snow, a landscape of pure white, silent, and menacing. The sun shone with a cold, brilliant light on the devastation. Many cabins were crushed or buried. Chimneys had collapsed. Livestock had frozen in their barns. From the ridge, they could see no smoke from the homes of 3 families who lived farther down the valley. It was a stark and terrible accounting. But from Elias's chimney, a thin, steady plume of smoke rose into the clean, cold air. It was a beacon. The weeks that followed were a blur of communal effort and grim discovery. The families who had not made it to the shelter were found frozen in their homes. The loss carved a permanent scar on the heart of the small community. But those who had survived were bound together by the shared experience in the heat room. The old hierarchies were gone. Mr. Sterling worked alongside the poorest farmer, digging out a collapsed barn, his soft hands now blistered and raw. The mockery aimed at Elias had vanished, replaced by a deep, almost fearful respect. They did not ask him for explanations. They asked for help. Mr. Gable was the first. "Show us," he said, standing before Elias, his hat in his hands. "Show us how to build one." Elias did not hoard his father's knowledge. He brought out the leather-bound journal and opened it on the table. The diagrams and calculations that had once seemed like the ravings of a madman now looked like scripture. One by one, then in groups, the men of the valley came to Elias's cabin. They studied the drawings, asked quiet, practical questions. Elias answered them in his usual way, with few words, pointing to a diagram, explaining the principle of thermal mass, the importance of the insulating gap, the precise angle of a flue. That spring, the valley was filled with the sound of digging. Not one pit, but a dozen. They called them Elias cellars, or stone hearts. Elias moved from homestead to homestead, advising on the placement of the core, the proper mix for the mortar, the careful fitting of the stones. He was no longer the strange orphan boy. He was the keeper of the wisdom that had saved them. Lena worked beside him, organizing the women to provide food and water for the work crews, her quiet competence a perfect match for his own. They were married that autumn in a simple ceremony in the newly rebuilt meeting hall, the whole valley in attendance. Their life together was built on a foundation as solid as the stones Elias had laid. Years passed. The community thrived. The winters still came, fierce and unforgiving, but they were no longer a terror. The stone hearts, fed by small, efficient fires, kept the homes warm and safe. The valley became known for its resilience, a place where people knew how to live with the cold, not just fight it. Travelers would bring stories of the town where the houses were heated from the earth itself. Men from other settlements came to learn, and Elias, with Lena at his side, would share his father's journal, the knowledge spreading like seeds on the wind. Elias and Lena raised 3 children in the small cabin. They grew up knowing the story of the great blizzard, of the room under the ground that had been their town's ark. For them, it was not a marvel. It was simply home. One crisp autumn evening, when Elias was a man of 50, Boro, now ancient and silver-muzzled, lifted his head from his place by the hearth. He looked at Elias, his old yellow eyes full of a deep and final understanding. He gave a soft sigh, laid his head back on his paws, and was still. His great, loyal heart had stopped its beating. The loss was a quiet, profound ache, the closing of a chapter that had begun with a boy and his dog digging a hole in the ground. Elias carried the old dog's body, surprisingly light in his arms, up the hill behind the cabin and buried him under a tall pine tree that looked out over the entire valley. He fashioned a simple marker from a smooth river stone. He carved no name, just the rough outline of a sleeping dog. Elias grew old. His hair turned the color of winter frost, and his hands, though still strong, were gnarled from a lifetime of work. He saw his grandchildren playing in the yard, their laughter echoing in the clean mountain air. He became the quiet elder of the town, a living legend who rarely spoke of the past. He didn't have to. The proof of his work was all around him, in the warm, safe homes and the plumes of smoke that rose from a dozen chimneys, thin and efficient against the winter sky. He outlived Lena by 5 years, a period of quiet solitude spent tending his small garden and watching the seasons turn. The fire in his hearth never went out. The stones his father had dreamed of, the stones he had laid with his own bleeding hands, still held their warmth. One morning, in his 82nd year, he did not wake up. He died peacefully in his sleep, in the sturdy bed in the small cabin, kept warm to the very end by the gentle, radiant heat of the earth. The entire valley came to bury him. They laid him to rest on the hill beside the weathered stone that marked Borrow's grave. Mr. Gable's grandson, now a man himself, carved the headstone. It was made of the same gray creek stone Elias had used to build his room. It was simple, bearing only his name and the years of his life. There was no need to list his accomplishments. His monument was the town itself. Decades later, long after everyone who had known him was gone, the story was still told. They said a quiet boy had listened to the wisdom of the earth and taught a whole valley how to survive. When the winter winds howled and the snow piled in deep, impassable drifts, the people of the valley would stoke their small, steady fires, feeling the deep, constant warmth rise from the stones beneath their feet. They were safe. They were home. And on the hill overlooking the town, the 2 simple stone markers stood as silent witnesses, a testament to a young man, his faithful dog, and the unconventional wisdom that had given them all a future. The stone heart he had built, buried and unseen, continued to beat, a quiet, enduring legacy of warmth in a cold, hard world.